You are 11 years old, standing in a cave in southern France, and your right hand is holding a torch. Not because you chose that hand, because someone made you. The pigment goes on with the left. The torch stays in the right. Every painted hand on that wall says the same thing. And yet somewhere in that group, one child kept getting it wrong. And what happened to that child is written into your own skull. Look at those cave walls now. Hundreds of hand stencils across Europe and Indonesia. Someone pressed a palm to rock and blew pigment around it. Almost all of them are left hands, which sounds like evidence of left-handed painters until you think about it for one more second. If your left hand is on the wall, your right hand is holding the pigment tube. The stencils aren't a record of left-handers. They're a record of right-handers, 30,000 years deep, doing exactly what you do. And here's the strange part. In every population ever measured, Ice Age Europeans, Amazonian foragers, medieval Londoners, modern Tokyo office workers, the ratio holds it roughly 9-to-1. 9 right hands, 1 left. It does not drift. It does not vanish. Something that rare and that persistent in biology usually means one of two things. It's useless and harmless, or it's paying for itself somehow. Left-handedness is not harmless. We'll get to what it costs. If even one of your ancestors had fumbled a spear throw with the wrong hand, once at the wrong moment, you would not exist. Every one of them got it right, most of them with the same hand. The real answer to what happened to left-handed ancient humans is darker than they were fine, actually. It involves a specific pattern of skeletal injury, a set of scratched teeth, and one theory built entirely on violence. I'm not explaining the violence part yet. Here's why this matters more than trivia. Handedness is one of the very few behavioral traits that fossilizes. Thoughts don't survive. Language doesn't survive. But the hand you favored left marks on your arm bones, your teeth, your tools, and the debris on your workshop floor. It's one of the only windows we have into the individual behavior of a person who died 200,000 years ago. Not their species, not their culture. That specific person and what they did with their hands every single day. And it's a window into your own brain. Because handedness is not really about hands. It's about lateralization, the division of labor between the two halves of your brain. In most right-handers, language sits primarily on the left side, the same side that controls the right hand. That coupling is one of the deepest structural facts about the human mind. So when you ask what happened to left-handed ancient humans, you're really asking a stranger question. You're asking whether their brains were organized differently from yours, and whether that difference was tolerated, punished, or quietly useful. Sit with that for a second. Somewhere in your family line, going back 100,000 generations, there were left-handers. Their brains were wired on a slightly different plan than the majority around them. They survived long enough to pass genes to you. Let's start with the myth we need to demolish first. The myth is that left-handedness is a modern accident, a rarity that emerged with civilization, or that ancient societies simply beat it out of people until it nearly disappeared. It's a comfortable story. It's also wrong, and the evidence against it is unusually clean. Take the teeth. In 1994, and in a long series of studies since, researchers examined the front teeth of hominins from Cima de los Huesos in Spain, a site holding the remains of dozens of individuals, dated to roughly 430,000 years ago. Not the shape of the teeth, the scratches on them. When you hold food or hide in your teeth, pull it tight with one hand, and cut upward with a stone flake in the other, the blade occasionally skids off the material and drags across your enamel. It leaves a diagonal groove. The angle of that groove tells you which hand held the blade, because the geometry only works one way. Across the analyzed Cima individuals, the overwhelming majority of scratch patterns indicate right-hand tool use. The commonly cited figures land in the range of 90+% right-handed. That's not a modern ratio imposed on ancient people. That's the modern ratio, already fully formed, in a population that predates our species. The pattern shows up in Neanderthals too. Analyses of Neanderthal dental microwear across multiple European sites have produced the same lopsided result, a strong right-hand majority, with a small persistent minority going the other way. Same for the arm bones. Neanderthal humerus asymmetry, the difference in bone thickness between the right and left upper arm, is famously extreme. Heavily developed on the right in most individuals, consistent with a lifetime of one-sided forceful work. So the myth dies here. Left-handers were not created by modernity, and they were not erased by antiquity. They were a stable minority before we were us, which raises the actual question. Why 9-to-1? Why not 50-50, like every other paired trait in your body? The mechanism starts with something called cerebral lateralization. Your brain is not one processor. It's two hemispheres running partly different software, connected by a thick cable of fibers called the corpus callosum. Specializing each side has a real computational advantage. You avoid duplicating expensive machinery, and you cut the delay of shuttling every signal across the midline. Fine motor sequencing, the kind of precise, ordered movement you need to nap a stone blade or thread a needle, appears to be dominated by one hemisphere in most people, usually the left, which controls the right hand. That's the population level story, and it explains why there's a dominant side at all. It does not explain why the dominant side is the same one for almost everybody, because here's the thing about a 50-50 world. If handedness were random, you'd still get individual lateralization. Everyone would have a favored hand, but the population would split evenly, the way it roughly does in many other animals. Cats show individual paw preference with only weak population-level bias. Some parrot species lean left as a group. Humans lean right, hard, and have done so for at least 400,000 years. Population-level bias, that strong needs a population-level explanation. Something that made it better to be handed the same way as your neighbor. The leading candidates involve teaching, tool inheritance, and social imitation. If you learn to butcher by copying the person beside you, matching their orientation is cheaper than mirroring it. Copy the majority and you learn faster. But every explanation built on conformity runs into a wall. If matching the group is so advantageous, left-handedness should have been eliminated entirely thousands of generations ago. It wasn't. It sat at 10% and refused to move. Something is actively protecting it. We'll get to what. It's the most uncomfortable idea in this entire story. Look at the physical record. At Boxgrove in England, at sites across Africa and Europe, archaeologists have studied the debris from stone toolmaking. The flakes struck off a core as it's shaped. When a napper works a core, they rotate it in one hand and strike with the other, and the resulting flakes carry a subtle directional signature in their surface features, and in the pattern of the scars left behind. Analyses of these assemblages consistently recover a right-hand dominant signal. Not universal. Dominant add the cyma teeth. An analyzed sample in which the right-hand pattern appears in roughly 9 out of 10 individuals, 430,000 years ago. Add the modern global surveys. Large cross-cultural studies of handedness, including work drawing on samples in the hundreds of thousands, put left-handedness at roughly 10% worldwide, with real variation between countries driven substantially by cultural pressure rather than biology. 10%. 10% across 400,000 years, across every continent, across foragers and farmers and city dwellers. Read that number again. Not 10% in one place. 10% everywhere, for longer than our species has existed. Then there's the harder evidence. Skeletal studies of injury patterns in Neanderthals. Most famously, the analysis of trauma distribution, including the pattern of head and upper body injuries, have been used to argue for close quarters, high-risk activity, whether hunting or conflict. Related work on cranial injuries in ancient populations has looked at which side of the skull gets hit, because that depends on which hand the attacker used. This line of evidence is genuinely contested, and the sample sizes are small. I'm flagging that honestly, but it's the hinge the whole story turns on. Here's the twist. For most of recorded history, left-handedness was treated as a defect to be corrected. The word sinister comes from the Latin for left. Children were tied, slapped, and retrained into their 80s in some countries. The assumption underneath all of it was that being left-handed is simply a worse way to be. The archaeological record does not support that assumption, and the modern record contradicts it in a specific, measurable domain. In interactive sports, fencing, boxing, cricket, baseball, tennis, table tennis, left-handers are dramatically overrepresented relative to their share of the population. The standard explanation is the fighting hypothesis, sometimes called negative frequency-dependent selection. It's simple. If 90% of your opponents are right-handed, everyone gets enormous practice against right-handers and almost none against left-handers. The left-hander has faced your style 10,000 times. You have faced theirs almost never. The advantage is not strength or skill, it's unfamiliarity. And critically, the advantage shrinks as left-handers become more common. That's what makes it self-limiting. A rare left-hander is dangerous. A world of left-handers is just a world, which turns the whole moral framing inside out. The trait that got children beaten in schoolrooms may be the same trait that kept some of your ancestors alive in a fight they otherwise would have lost. Now let's close the loop I opened earlier. The thing actively protecting left-handedness from being eliminated. If matching the group is efficient, and it is, then conformity should have driven left-handedness to zero. The only way a costly minority trait survives across 400,000 years is if it gets more valuable as it gets rarer. That's the definition of negative frequency-dependent selection, and it's the mechanism the fighting hypothesis proposes. The prediction is testable, and researchers have tested it. Charlotte Forey and Michelle Raymond examined handedness across traditional societies and reported a correlation between rates of left-handedness and rates of violence. Societies with higher homicide rates tended to show higher frequencies of left-handers. The relationship they described was striking, with left-handedness ranging from a small percentage in the most peaceful groups studied to substantially higher in the most violent. I have to be straight with you about this. That work has been criticized on sample size, on confounds, and on the difficulty of measuring both violence and handedness consistently across cultures. It is not settled science. Other researchers have proposed the advantage arose in cooperative contexts rather than combat, or that it's a byproduct of developmental noise in brain lateralization with no adaptive story at all. But the shape of the answer is the same regardless of which version wins. Left-handers weren't preserved because they were equal. They were preserved because they were different, and difference had a payoff that only worked while it stayed rare. So what happened to left-handed ancient humans? Nothing happened to them. That's the answer. They were there the whole time at the same ratio, doing the same work, and occasionally holding a decisive advantage that nobody around them could name. Sit with the scale of that, the behavioral evidence stacks up from a completely different direction than the bones. Look at animals. Chimpanzees show hand preference in specific tasks, termite fishing, nut cracking, but the population-level bias is far weaker than in humans and varies by task and by community. Gorillas and orangutans show similar individual-level preference without a strong species-wide skew. Whatever produced the human 9-to-1 pattern happened in our lineage, after we split from theirs, and it went deep. Then look at what happens when culture pushes. In countries with strong historical suppression of left-hand use, measured left-handedness rates drop sharply, in some surveys to a few percent, while in countries without that pressure they sit near 10 to 12%. Same species, same genes, broadly. Different reported numbers. That gap is not biology. That gap is school teachers, and it tells you something about the ancient record, too. If a culture can push measured left-handedness from 12% down to 3% in a generation, then the archaeological ratios we recover are not pure biology either. They're biology filtered through whatever social pressure existed at the time. When we find 9-to-1 at Cima de los Huesos, we cannot tell you how much of that is brain wiring, and how much is a 400,000-year-old version of somebody's grandmother correcting a child's grip. We cannot interview a Neanderthal. That limit is real, and it doesn't go away. What we can say is that the minority never disappeared. In any population, ever measured. Here's the modern mirror, and it's the uncomfortable one. For roughly 2 centuries, industrial societies ran a large, uncontrolled experiment enforcing neurological conformity. Children were retrained, sometimes brutally, on the theory that one brain organization was correct and the other was broken. There is evidence that forced switching is associated with stuttering and other difficulties, though the causal picture remains debated. Ancient humans, as far as we can tell, did not do this. There's no evidence of systematic left-hand suppression in the Paleolithic record, no pattern of injury, no exclusion from tool sites, no separate burials. The tools were made by hand for a hand, not stamped out for a standard user. A flint blade doesn't care which way you hold it. Your kitchen scissors do. They lived with a 10% minority for 400,000 years without deciding it was a problem. We took about 200 years to decide it was, and then spent a century undeciding it. Nobody sensible is arguing we should go back. Mass production made tools cheap enough that everyone has them, and the standardization that made your scissors right-handed is the same standardization that made them affordable. None of this is a moral failure. It's a trade-off nobody consciously made. So look at your hands again. One of them is dominant. You didn't choose it. It was largely settled before you were born, by a mechanism we still don't fully understand, running in a lineage older than our species. If it's your right hand, you're doing what 9 out of 10 of your ancestors did. If it's your left, you're the 10% that never went away. Not a defect, not an error. a rare configuration that persisted through 400,000 years of stone, ice, and pressure to conform, because in some moment we can no longer see, being unexpected was worth something. They didn't know why the minority existed. They just never bothered to erase it. You didn't invent your hand. You inherited it.